Good afternoon, everyone. Can see that you're all coming through, so great to see 100 or so people on the call. Today, we've got Jayne Hall with us speaking on the roles and responsibilities around the Building Safety Act and what has changed. So it should be a really interesting session, and we'd be grateful if you could put any Q&A that you've got into the Q&A section. There's voting on there, so you can upvote. If someone's got a similar question to yourself, then do upvote one, so we don't get too many questions for after the presentation. Okay, I'm not going to speak for too long, so we've got quite a bit to cover. I'll hand you over to Trevor.
Right, want to get cracking? Yeah, Jayne, you're clearly a hot ticket. They're still pouring through the doors from the green room. So there you go. I wish I could generate such interest with my presentations, but poor. Anyway, such a big audience on this one. Been a while since we last did one. This one is about the Building Safety Act and the question, what's changed? And that's the subject for today. Well, where do we start with that one? Because in recent years, we've witnessed unprecedented changes, haven't we, to the way we regulate the construction industry. And these have had major implications for people, people designing buildings, people operating buildings, and people constructing buildings, obviously. And that's not just the higher risk residential buildings. Yes, we know that there's been an impact on those, but it's every building, right down to Mrs. Bloggs' single-storey rear extension. There's an effect on all of those. And as well as architects and builders, the changes have also radically affected people in my profession. We're now called building inspectors again, which is ironic because it's when I started off back in the 80s, that's what we were called before we became building control officers. Of course, occasionally a few people called us other names as well, which I'm not going to mention. But the point is, I don't know how other people feel in the audience. I imagine, as usual, we've got quite a generous smattering of building control people listening in. I think some of these changes have taken a bit of the pleasure out of the job. I'll use the phrase back in the day because I'm allowed to. I'm an old fossil. And back in the day, most of us would have got satisfaction from working with, the word with, we called them customers then as well, with customers, builders, designers, and we worked to impart knowledge, advice on compliance, and we worked with them to try and find solutions to the many and various challenges that construction work inevitably throws up between the inception of the building through design and through to completion. And that was part of the job, and it was part of why we got up in the morning. And that's all changed now, unfortunately. We now have to carefully tread what is a narrow line between acting like a job's worth, in other words, offering no help at all to anybody, but also not gravitating towards the responsibilities of the designer, and not leaving phones on either when you're doing a presentation, because that is highly unprofessional. No, I'm sorry. We have to walk that narrow line between not helping at all and then offering so much help that we're starting to take on the designer's role. So if you have noticed that new attitude from our HBC surveyors and other surveyors around the country, then please realise it's nothing personal. It's the Building Safety Act that's brought this about, and we're having to abide by it. And there are sensible reasons for it. I'm not having a moan for just for the sake of it. Anyway, I'll get off that soapbox. It's time to hear a lot more detail on the topic from our speaker today. And as you've heard, it's my esteemed colleague, Jayne Hall. She's Hertfordshire Building Control's Director of Quality and Compliance. She's got a hell of a CV, which I haven't got time to go through, but she's also one of the few people, if not the only person, I'm not sure, to have acted as president of both Local Authority Building Control and of the Chartered Association of Building Engineers. So a great person to have on the team. I'll say no more. Jayne, over to you. Take the floor and tell us more.
Oh, thank you, Trevor. I hope I can live up to expectations after that intro. No, thank you very much for giving me the floor. All being well, I think you'll be able to see my first slide. And we're nearly 12 months down the line from the mandatory registration of building inspectors and building control approvers. So we've seen sort of how the changes are starting to bed in, whether we're happy that they're bedding in as hoped, who knows? But hopefully this little set of slides that I've got here will touch on the stuff that you want to know. And if you've got any questions, I think Rachel will be accepting questions and into the chat, I think. And
Yeah, if you
so
could put questions in the Q&A, we've got a Q&A button. Any questions that you've got, yeah, please put them in the Q&A and we'll do them after the presentation. Thank
fabulous.
you.
Thank you, Rachel, for that, because I obviously didn't know what I was talking about there. So here we are. So yes, I'm Jayne Hall. I've worked in building control now for since 2003. I entered building control when Part E was just being revised, and I did wonder what I'd done. I did wonder whether I should ask for my old job back when I started training on that one. But no, I've been in the industry building control for 20 years, and in the industry for sort of nearly 40 now, which is a bit scary. And I've worked mainly in local authority building control, but I had a little stint in the private sector, and I did manage a team of uh, the built environment enforcement team up at South Gloucestershire Council for a while. So I've seen a bit of planning enforcement and stuff like that as well. So I've been around the block a bit, and so it's sort of eye-opening to me to see how sort of change and transformation happens. So but this has got to take the biscuit, I have to say, and I expect most people in most whatever discipline you're in, whether you're in building control, whether you're a designer, whether you're a contractor, or whether you're a developer or a client, you will have probably been completely sort of floored by some of these changes that have come through. So just a reminder of where they came from, and I'm going to fly through these because I think most of us are all familiar now that it all started with that tragic event at Grenfell Tower where 72 people lost their lives, and the aftermath of that, which sort of found virtually our entire industry to be rather lacking in coordination and ethics and capability and competence. So we had our Grenfell Tower tragedy, and then Dame Judith Hackett made lots of recommendations in her Building a Safer Future independent review, her final report, which has led us to where we are now. So it started with the recognition that fire safety really needed to be looked at an early stage. So we got Planning Gateway 1, which introduced us to a sort of golden thread of information. And the principle of that is having the right information in order to understand the building and the steps needed to keep it, both the building and the people in it, safe. And so that starts at planning stage. And so designers, architects will probably be sort of familiar with that, and that element only applies to the high risk buildings, the high rise residential buildings. But in principle, all of these changes apply to everything, and they encompass the whole raft of building regulations. It isn't just Part B, it isn't just fire safety, even though it was a fire that led to the sort of having us under the magnifying glass, approach. So the Building Safety Act was conceived, and in April 2022, it was granted royal assent. It was first published in July 2020, actually, but it didn't become law till 2022, and then took another 2 years to implement. So actually, some parts of it are still unenacted. And again, I think that's probably been one of the big frustrations for people, adapting to this change, is the way that it sort of seems to have A, taken a very long time, and B, seems to have released itself in sort of dribs and drabs, and it does become sort of very confusing. But the Building Safety Act is the primary legislation. It establishes in law the framework for the building safety, both during design and in construction and also in occupation. And a lot of detail of how this act operates in practice is defined through the secondary legislation, which are known as statutory instruments, and that's where the building regulations fit into the scene. We've got a building advisory committee. It used to have a building regulations advisory committee, but now we have a building advisory committee, which shows how much broader the whole subject is about building safety. And they replace the building regulations advisory committee, and their role is to advise the building safety regulator on change and emerging issues across the built environment. We're still only on December, so the next change that they introduced was the restricting the use of combustible materials in approved document B, but there's been several changes ever since, and I think we will probably hear a lot more about changes and amendments to approved documents in the future. So, you know, you've got to keep your eye on the ball really with these regulations, because although the regulations might change, the guidance might adapt and evolve and alter, hopefully to become more straightforward and clearer and easier to understand. But you know, I'm not going to hold my breath on that one. We've had the mandatory registration of high-rise residential buildings in England. That brought with them some duty holders as well. You've got your accountable persons and principal accountable people. So, you know, making individuals responsible for what they're doing is probably a key cornerstone to all this regulation change. It's about accountability and being competent to do what you're doing. In August 2023, it doesn't seem that long ago, but that was when the new regulations were published, and it changed. We had the Building Regulations Amendment England regulations, we had the Building Higher Risk Buildings Procedures England regulations, and the best one of all, the Building Approved Inspectors etc. and Review of Decisions England regulations. So you know, it's not surprising that it's all complicated with names like that. And we saw the building safety regulator become, you know, the building control body for the high risk buildings in October 2023, which is just over 12 months ago. Well, 16 months ago. And then last year, on the 6th of April, there was mad panic as everybody practicing building control as a career, as a profession, had to register themselves. Not just individuals, but all the approved inspectors had to re-register with the building safety regulator, because they were previously overseen by the FCABE, and they all had to go through all sorts of hoops and obstacles to get registered as building control approvers. So, pressing the wrong button here. Sorry. So the Building Safety Act. So it's the most considered significant piece of construction legislation since 1984. So, you know, it was 40 years ago. The Building Act 1984 came into play, and I can remember that because I was just cutting my teeth on in an architect's office as an trainee architectural technician then, and I can remember I didn't see the old style regulations. I mean, some of us may still remember those as well, but the approved documents had come in, and the new Building Act had brought everything together, and I didn't go through that change. That change had already happened, and I sort of, pursued my career knowing that way forward, and was very comfortable with it until last year. But anyway, so the principal intention is the safety of people in and around buildings, and to improve the standard of our buildings, and it applies to all buildings. I mean, the focus has always been high risk buildings, multi-story buildings, but it isn't. The Building Safety Act brings everything under its umbrella. It's, as I said, introduced the building control regulator, the new building control regime, and the new duty holder roles, which is probably what I'm going to just focus a little bit more on later in this presentation here. But its emphasis is on the importance of competency. And competency is well, I suppose we all thought we were competent before, but now we've got to prove it. Somebody's got to assess what competence is, what our competence is, and judge us on it, and our skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviour all come into play. And the other thing the Building Safety Act did, which is worth mentioning, is it did introduce measures to protect leaseholders from the cladding remediation costs, because the government obviously wanted to make sure that, you know, something like Grenfell wasn't going to happen again. And again, you know, time ticks along. We're still struggling away with getting that work done. Again, that's another story. Of course, it wasn't just the building regulations that were impacted by the Building Safety Act. We've got the Fire Safety Act 2021, which clarified the scope of the RRO, the Fire Safety Order. It's made it absolutely clear that it applies to the structure, external walls, and individual flat entrance doors, because there was some debate over what did the Fire Safety Order cover, particularly when you're talking about common areas, and were entrances to the flats between those common areas and the individual premises included. And of course, they're critical when you think about it. If someone changes their front door to something that won't hold back a fire, then you're putting everybody else in the whole building at risk. So that was quite significant. Other regulations, Fire Safety England regs, for instance, ensures that, you know, it requires people to provide information to the fire and rescue services. And the Defective Premises Act, that's probably got the most serious implication, because it's extended the time period for which people can make claims for defective work relating to the construction of their dwelling. If it renders the building unfit for habitation, or the dwelling unfit for habitation, then claims can be made from it used to be 6 years, a 6-year deadline. That's extended to 15. And where it relates to the construction of the building rather than the refurbishment, there's actually a retrospective 30-year limitation period. So that's quite a significant change. There's been a change to other legislation, Architects Act. It established an appeals committee addressing discipline and professional conduct. I think RIBA are on the case with that. Obviously, the changes to the Building Act, well, I mean, you know, there's a lot of those, and the building regulations as well, and various other legislation, leasehold, you know, to do with leasehold reform, and it's provided, that's the part that's provided the protection for leaseholders, and the construction products regulation, which is it introduces rights for those who have a legal or equitable interest in a dwelling to take action against construction product manufacturers where a construction product fails to comply with the construction product requirement if it's been missold or inherently defective, and where use of those products causes or contributes to dwellings becoming unfit for habitation. So it's certainly you know, has made some very sort of impactful changes. So enough on that. High risk buildings, the definition of high risk building is basically, well, we know that residential unit or any other unit of living accommodation is defined in the Building Safety Act. And in England, and I don't know if I said it at the beginning, I was meant to say it at the beginning, I'm talking about the law in England today. It's a bit different in Wales. They've got their own building control regime since 2011, and they actually even have a different definition of high-risk buildings to what we do in England. So, but 18 metres high, a minimum of 7 stories with at least 2 residential units, and a residential unit can be a flat, studio flat, HIMO, house and multiple occupation, shared student accommodation, or a unit within a supported accommodation. But if the entire building is used in one of the if it's used as a hospital, care home, secure residential institution, a hotel or military barracks, it's not a high-risk building, even if it's tall. Okay, so that's been clarified for us. So the higher risk building function is overseen by the building safety regulator. So Hertfordshire Building Control don't touch any of that work at all anymore, other than to pass it on. If we get an application, we can't accept it, and likewise nor can registered building control approvers. We have to pass that work up to the building safety regulator, and the regime there is so much more stringent. I'm going to probably not touch on it today at all. I'm trying to keep it general and stick with what most of us are working with. There's plenty of training courses out there for HRBs. There's a new definition of commencement of work, which is an interesting one to understand. We used to have commencement of work was just notified. It was as long as you provided written notice that you'd started. This is to local authorities. I don't think you had to actually notify commencement in if you were using an approved inspector, but now everybody has to have a commencement of work, and this is because it refers to the point where the construction product is actually considered to have started. So you can start work, and you probably still need to notify your building control provider when you've started work, but actually you need to, there's a point at which it's regarded as being commenced as well. And for existing and new buildings, commencement must occur within 3 years of the application for building control approval, or that application will lapse and become of no effect. For complex buildings, commencement's when the foundations and structure of the lowest floor level are completed. For other building work, commencement is where specific subsurface structures are completed, or when 15% of the works are commenced, have been carried out for all other works. And this is to do with, longevity of applications. Because applications for building control approval can lapse, you need to really tighten up on that definition of when building work has commenced. Okay, the 15% is probably open to interpretation, but it depends very much on what it is. So the new regulations, I'm repeating myself a bit here, but the new regulations brought in this new building control regime. With that, all sorts of new application processes, and the key thing that it introduced to us, which is put clearly and under no circumstances could it be misunderstood, that clients, designers and contractors now have a legal role to play in the life of a building project. It was always the case that responsibility for compliance laid with those people, in probably primarily the client or the building owner, because that would be the person who the building control regulator, the local authority would go for if there was any sort of compliance issue that needed enforcement action. But now we've got the client, principal designer and principal contractor all have written down very clearly in the law obligations and responsibilities. Moving on to building control inspectors, obviously we now have to be registered. We have to prove our competency. Anybody working in a regulatory or building control role where they're carrying out restricted building control functions must be registered with the building safety regulator. We must, in order to be registered, we have to prove our competency and pass exams, professional interviews. And there are 4 classes of registration based on our skills, knowledge and experience. That is class 1, it would be anybody who's a trainee, or you can register at class 1 if you haven't sat your competence exams. And you can also be at class 1 while you're waiting to elevate to another grade through sort of competency assessment. So class 2 is your sort of standard grade. That's mostly sort of domestic work or fairly straightforward building projects, what I call minor works, your domestic stuff or your small commercial, simple buildings. And then class 3 moves you into another arena where you're working with more complex buildings and higher risk buildings as well. So complex commercial buildings of say modern methods of construction, unusual construction types, those sort of things. And then you've got your manager class, and to register as a class 4 manager, you also have to be registered at either class 2 or class 3. So that you can demonstrate you are actually a building control competent person. It's against the law to impersonate a building inspector. I've never met anyone who has impersonated a building inspector, but I'm guessing there might be some people out there who would. I don't know. It'd be interesting to know if anyone else has had any experience of that. But yeah, I suppose impersonate is the dodgy word there, because actually it's anybody who's not registered who is then performing the role of a building inspector is breaking the law. And we have strict codes of conduct to adhere to. Key performance indicators to report on. That's mainly for our employers to do. So local authorities and registered building control approvers have to put in annual, quarterly and annually returns on what they're actually doing. And the building safety regulator will be able to sort of benchmark different building control bodies and how they're performing and see, what the state of building control up and down the country is. So there's monitoring and reporting, and of course we're subject to audit. Building safety regulator can come in and inspect us at any time to see if we're doing what we say we're doing, and if they find us slacking, they can throw sanctions at us, and maybe even prevent us from trading. It's quite serious, and I think it's meant to be. It was a wake-up call, and I think it's inevitable if the industry isn't performing properly and well as it should do, then someone's going to come in and start sort of banging their fist on the table and saying, well, you've got to do it this way then. And that's what's happened. So moving on to this sort of client, principal designer and principal contractor duties. So the duty holders, there's a duty to ensure that the building work they're going to do is compliant. The primary responsibility lies with those who initiate building work and those who play crucial roles in the design and construction processes. And that kind of makes sense. And they're accountable for ensuring that work is designed and constructed to comply with the building regulations. There are different categories of clients. There are domestic clients who are usually likely to be homeowners, maybe not part of any business. They're just having a bit of work done, an extension or a loft conversion or something done on their home. And a domestic client needs to appoint a principal designer to be in control of the design work, and a principal contractor. And if they don't appoint either of those, then the law assumes that the designer in control of the design phase is the principal contractor. the contractor in control of the construction phase becomes the principal contractor. It is complicated, but as it beds in, I think people will know what those roles are. So you know, you're either a client, or you're taking responsibility for the design, or you're taking responsibility for the construction. And ideally, you will all talk to each other. So there's a duty to ensure compliance. There's a duty to be competent, and it's essential for all these duty holders to have the necessary skills, knowledge, and experience and behaviours relevant to their designated task. And an organisation needs to have the organisational capability to fulfil the duties. So, you know, you have to be properly resourced with the right people to deliver the goods. And the duty to cooperate, coordinate and communicate. Duty holders are required to work together, effectively maintaining clear lines of communication, sharing information and collaborating throughout the process. One would think that didn't need a law to embed that into us, but you know, clearly it was apparent through, you know, the investigation after Grenfell that you know, lines of communication weren't working, so it's now there in the law. So there we go. So the client must ensure that their designer or contractor are competent for the work proposed, and the designer or contractor must not take on work where they don't possess the necessary competence. Now, we're still feeling our way about how do you demonstrate that somebody's competent? You know, that there aren't out there yet lots of industry schemes to give people the peace of mind that someone they're employing is competent. So I'm, you know, at the moment it's a feel your way kind of thing, but they will evolve because it's an expectation, it's demanded by the law, and I'm guessing that we will soon see more schemes coming up from different disciplines, whereby people can sign up, and a lot of the professional bodies are working on this and evolving their own competency assessments, and so we will see more of this. But you know, the building control profession was, you know, whether we liked it or not, we were the guinea pigs. So and it's worked for us, you know, and fortunately, quite a lot of us have, proven that we do know what we're doing, and those that haven't registered, those that don't want to register can move along and do something else. But you know, this is a you know, again, it's the way the law has made us behave this way. It's, I don't know what we feel about that. You can see it as a good thing, or you can see it as what a shame it had to happen. You know, what a shame we weren't doing it right in the first place. So domestic clients have similar responsibilities to, you know, other clients. I've said before, actually, I've probably preempted this slide. I've said if they fail to make the appointments, then the designer in control of the design phase becomes the principal designer, and the contractor becomes the principal contractor. And architects are the sort of natural principal designers in most cases, but interestingly, if the client only appoints the architect to undertake the planning drawings, for instance, and the contractor works to these, and the contractor effectively becomes both the designer and contractor through the sort of build out stage. So it would, the principal contractor may sometimes undertake dual roles, and it has huge implications for the many small builders who aren't insured or competent or even understand the design role, and you know, and they may not be able to, or afraid to undertake the design function and make that compliance statement at completion. So again, I'm hoping that what we'll start to see is better training and education coming through the you know, higher education system, where, you know, people entering the contracting profession who would normally do sort of well, forgive me for being out of date, but it's stuff like HNCs, I think, building regs have been very, very sort of poorly represented in most sort of educational packages. You don't really see much of a building control module. I think that's going to change as we move forward, because people will be demanding to know a bit about it, because they're going to have to sign declarations when they're doing building work that requires building control input. So I think we're going to see this change is going to carry on happening. So the client must ensure the designer and contractor are competent for the work proposed, and the designer and contractor must not take on any work where they don't possess the competence. Again, it relies on people being honest about their own abilities as well. I mean, we see it quite a lot in the building control profession, particularly in the smaller minor works end of the market, where someone down the pub is, he's got himself a nice van and he's seen some tools on offer at B&Q, and then he sort of agrees over a pint that he's going to, knock down the wall in his neighbour's house so he can have a big kitchen diner, and he doesn't know what he's doing. And we see that frequently, and we still see it. We are still seeing it. It hasn't changed yet, but I think it will. I think it will definitely change, particularly when enforcement starts to come into play and we start taking people to task for doing things that they're not competent to do, and upsetting the building safety. On completion, all parties, all of the duty holders have to provide a joint written statement to the building control body that clearly states that the building work is compliant. Again, so there has to be some sort of understanding somewhere along the line that's about the building regulations that are relevant to the work that they're doing, because they have to sign that it complies. It's as simple as that. And they won't get a completion certificate if they don't. If it's a high risk building, I mean, you wouldn't even get you wouldn't get out of the starting block. You wouldn't even be getting to build it if it doesn't pass these sort of gateways that are set up at pre-construction and post-construction stage. But it's the smaller end of the market that's going to sort of see problems arising where there's that sort of lack of knowledge, lack of skill. And again, the whole industry has to look at itself, because there are, huge construction skills shortages still. And that will take some time to resolve as people are coming through apprenticeship schemes and learning their job, and, learning their job in the context of these new regulations. So if the client only appoints a designer to take planning drawings, have I done this before? Am I repeating myself? I'm beginning to think I've said this before. So the contractor can take on dual roles of principal designer and principal contractor. So quite often, yes, I mean, certainly currently people will engage a designer just to get the planning permission, and they say, thanks very much, we don't need you anymore, we're going to find our own builder, and off we go. Of course, that means that, changes are made on site in a sort of uncontrolled way, and who's responsible for that, because the person who did the planning drawings is going to probably turn around and say, well, I didn't design that, that's not my design. So it will be the contractor. The contractor will find themselves responsible. And I'm sure this is a duplicate slide, because I have said that before, so sorry, repeating myself. Well, drill the message in, you'll remember it if I repeat it. So the other thing that has been sort of a bit destabilizing is all the new terminology, the roles, the timelines that are important for us to understand. It is quite complicated. So we have to ensure when we're accepting an application, our application forms have changed quite significantly. Because of the introduction of these duty holder roles, we now require information about those duty holders, and in some cases, you may not have appointed a contractor, so you might not have someone in post in mind. But as long as you can provide that information before someone starts building your building work, you're probably going to be all right. For high risk buildings, everything has to be in place at the time of your application. But client, principal designer details, we need to ensure we have all of that application so that we can validate validate the form and set you on your way. Full contact details must be provided on every application, and submissions to the building control now do rely on the designer's justification of compliance. So it used to be that a designer could sort of pop in a sort of very basic plan, perhaps with a few scant notes on, and hope that when we sent back our plan check notes or observations, that it would point them in the direction of what they needed to fill the gaps. Now the designers need to be telling us that what they've done is compliant, and we'll be checking that we agree with them, rather than checking for gaps and asking them for more information. We will probably ask for more information when we do need it, but yes, that is. I mean, Trevor was alluding to that when he introduced me. That it has changed the job significantly. But building control is regulatory now. We're not so much part of the design team. We spent many years sort of trying to get in early anyway, to meet with people and sort of assist them towards the ultimate goal, which is a compliant and safe building. But now we can't be seen to be indulging people in sort of what they call design advice. We can give general compliance advisory input, but we certainly can't be sort of suggesting a material that you should use or how thick your insulation should be like we used to. So there has been an impact on building control. And initial notices, it isn't any different for the registered building control approvers. I mean, they are similarly affected, and all of the you'll probably notice if you're using building control bodies, whether private or public sector, that the forms have reflected the process changes. Registered building control inspectors will not be able to offer design input by law. It's part of our code of conduct, so we can't do that. It seemed to be a conflict of interest, and that's a no-no. So yes, a completion certificate won't be issued until the signed compliance statement from the client, principal designer and principal contractor has been received. So even if a client doesn't keep on their designer during the build out phase, there is a requirement that the principal designer signs a compliance statement to say that, as far as they're aware, if their design has been followed, that the work complies, and the contractor has to do the same. So if anything changes along the way, it's ideally needs to be approved by the designer. Otherwise, the contractor will take on that design responsibility. And the original designer might turn around and say, I've got no business signing that form. The design's changed so much, it's not relevant to what I designed. The contractor will have to do it, and that's the way it will go. Operating standard rules. This is something the building safety regulator has, and this impacts on building control bodies. Practices, procedures, performance standards that are expected have been set out. They cover the systems and controls, our quality management of how we run our business and how we do the job. The people involved in the delivery of the building control functions, that's our registered building inspectors. The actual building control functions and enforcement and intervention. And this is all underpinned by monitoring arrangements including key performance indicators. And we must report on those. We must keep records and report on those. So there's quite a burden of administrative burden associated with that. Our code of conduct, it's published. It's an open document for all to see on the World Wide Web. So if you're a user of a building control body, you can look up to see how we should be behaving. If we're working within it, we can look it up to see how we should be behaving. The principles are we should be honest, we should act with integrity and maintain our professional competence. That is not just pass the competence assessment and get registered, but maintain that moving forward. The registration only lasts for 4 years for individuals. So in 2024, 2028, there'll be a rush to re-register. So we've got to be able to demonstrate that we are still competent in what we say we've been competent at, or if we've improved, we can perhaps re-register at a new class. We need to deliver our services with professional skill and care. And again, the code of conduct, the operating standard rules, they all sort of emphasize that if you don't do it the way you're supposed to do it, you could get into trouble and you could have your registration stripped from you. We need to uphold public trust and confidence in the provision of services and the profession. Well, that's the whole point of it. Public confidence was at rock bottom after Grenfell Tower, and probably before that, I expect probably there had been other incidents where the public had thought, what's building out of control? Can they help us? No. So we need to treat everyone fairly, and we need to act in compliance with our legal obligations as well. So the conflict of interest, usually that's a sort of whether they're real or perceived, we have to make sure we identify those. So if my sister-in-law wants her house extended, I would have to, and she wanted to use the company I work for, then I would have to say to my company, well, actually that is my sister-in-law. There's a relationship there. It's, again, common sense, and we should be doing that all the time. I mean, I have to say HBC was, we've always had a conflict of interest register. We didn't wait till the law made us, but now, of course, for everyone acting in this capacity, we have to identify conflicts of interest. We mustn't undertake work or continue to undertake work where a conflict of interest is identified. So bad luck if your sister's new boyfriend starts working on a site you're overseeing. You've got to make that clear and put some measures in place to mitigate it. If you can't remove a conflict of interest, then can you reasonably mitigate it? And if necessary, you have to cease to act. It's one of those things. So. And that is interesting in terms of the impact we've seen in some instances where a registered building control approver hasn't been able to carry on their project. They are now much more sort of upfront about, cancelling initial notices, and where that means that the work reverts to us. And there's a lot of misunderstanding out there in the public arena about that, even though the government have published frequently asked questions on it. So moving on, impacts on designers. Well, I keep going on about this, demonstrating competence to the client. I mean, a designer will need to think about how they do that now. Presumably, if you've worked on a similar type of project and it's been a success, and you can have testimonials from past clients and things like that, that might be okay. But ideally, we'll be having professionals registering and with professional bodies and having it proven without a doubt your competence, because it's gone through some sort of consistent assessment process. But we're still quite away from that being industry-wide. So that you've got to ensure your design is compliant, which means you have to understand the regulations and the regulations that apply to the work you're designing. And And in the case of high risk buildings, you have to establish a golden thread of information. You have to be very, very stringent about keeping your records and keeping your data and information all in order. You have a role of planning, managing, monitoring the building work during the design phase of the project, identify and document any changes to the design, make sure any amendments are compliant. You can assist your client with the building control floor plans application. You can communicate, you must communicate. I say you can, you must. It's a requirement in the regulations that you communicate, coordinate, and manage the project. So you need to speak to other designers, specialist designers. You need to, it's about a principal designer needs to take back control of the project, really. Not let the client just boot them into touch because they've got planning consent. You need to say, right, I need to, I have a role here to manage and help you, project manage your job. So it may be a good thing for designers, work stream wise. So it's not all bad. It's complicated, but it's not all bad. Issuing a compliance statement to the building control body to confirm you fulfilled your principal designer functions, and if necessary, prepare building safety information for the client. That's not just for high risk buildings. Any commercial building that's subject to RRO, there's regulation 38, which is fire safety information. So helping prepare all of that, collate that all together and put it into a file for the client so that they've got that information to continue with their management of that building. Not that building control oversees the management of buildings in occupation. That does tend to pass over to the fire safety authority, but a designer can play a very important role in making sure that all that information is collated together. So that's just some of the impacts and things that designers have. I'll skip that because it's blank. And then we have their impact on contractors. So again, pretty much the same. Demonstrate your competence to your client. So you've got to prove that you are capable of digging up their garden and putting in a foundation so that they can have an extension, or knocking through, taking out important structural elements of their building. So you need to be able to demonstrate that you are capable and you know what you're doing, and that you can do it in a compliant fashion, so it complies with the building regulations. And this is, I think, again, focusing back down onto those sort of smaller projects, the lower value work, where people have been watching Kevin McLeod on the telly. I hope he's not dialed in to watch me, but grand designs, they've got these aspirations that they can do it all themselves. They don't understand. And this is one of the things that we're hearing a lot of now. And something I said early on is that it's the people who don't know they're not competent that are dangerous, because they don't understand. They don't know what they don't know, and so this competence thing is a real, it could be a showstopper. If you don't know what you're doing, it's better to step away and say, I'm sorry, I don't know what I'm doing. So planning and managing, monitoring the building work during the construction phase, coordinating matters, making sure you talk to all your subcontractors, any specialists coming on board who are, they have duty holding roles as well to be compliant, but not the principal contractor role. Take all reasonable steps to communicate with them, liaise with the principal designer, share information with them that's relevant to the planning, management and monitoring of the design work. So, when you've got a good deal down the builder's merchant, don't just take it up. Make sure, double check, if you can, get an architect's instruction to make the change, so that everybody is knowing that any changes that are taking place are not going to impact or cause problems with compliance with the building regulations at the end of the day. So if requested, assist the client with providing information to others. And I think it probably says the same as on the designers, where I've gone off the page there. So on completion, sign that declaration that the work is compliant. Okay, so that's it really. I think I'm there. Competence is key. I did want to add a few more things. I've got no slides on it, but I did want to talk a little bit about enforcement. The enforcement tools have been strengthened, and there is an expectation that local authorities will enforce the building regs. Over the years, there's been a sort of leaning on a sort of informal methods to get people to comply with the building regulations, and in the worst case, probably just not give them a completion certificate, so that when they try to sell whatever it is they've built, they can't. But now, that's been sadly lacking in teeth. Before we've actually perhaps as local authorities, appetite for enforcement hasn't been very high, but now it has to be, because the building safety regulator is expecting local authorities to take a strong stand against safety issues and non-compliances in buildings. We've had enough bad press about, shocking state of new build houses where people buy a lovely new home and then find that, the snagging list goes, around the block. So we play a role in that, and we need to hold people to account if they're doing it wrong and consistently doing it wrong. Enforcement is something we're going to see more of. We still have the old Section 35, Section 36 notices that we can serve on people to enforce them to either remove or correct, non-compliant building work. But we also have, some more sort of what we're hoping to be more usable and more instantaneous tools to enforce the building regs in the form of compliance notices and stop notices. So if we see something happening on site that we think, whoa, actually, there's no way if you carry on doing that you're going to it's going to be compliant when you finished it, we can get people to stop work by serving a stop notice. And we can also, if we see a sort of perhaps a less risky situation, that does need to be attended to, we can issue a compliance notice which will set out what needs to be done to bring a non-compliant piece of building work back into compliance. And both of those, we can only issue them within a year of the non-compliance occurring, and they are appealable. So if you get served one, you can appeal it if you don't agree with it, and it goes to a tribunal who will either uphold your appeal or not. And if you don't comply, the local authority may then prosecute you if they wish to do so. And I think we will probably see that appetite for enforcement elevated as building safety regulators starts to look at building control bodies, which they are doing. They are auditing all building control bodies, including local authorities. And if they find them wanting, then again, they can put them into special measures and say, you've got to do something about that. So enforcement is going to be something we're going to see more of. And the other thing I touched on is about that sort of, well, I don't think we probably did expect to see so many cancellations, but we have had situations where, for instance, where a building control body has decided not to register as a building control approver, and of course there's live projects that have been cancelled, and they can either be passed on or transferred to another building control body if they wish to take on the work. But there's a very strict timescale in which to do that. I think it's 28 days from the date of cancellation. You have to have a new initial notice up and running, and there's criteria you have to meet for that to be acceptable. So the work that's already been started needs to have been checked and a statement that it's compliant up to the point at which it was transferred. Otherwise, the work does revert to local authority control. that puts quite a bit of pressure on local authority teams, resource wise. It's we should be rubbing our hands together with glee saying, oh, we got more work, because we do get paid for it, but that's that's a moot point. I mean, out of the some of the complaints we've had this year so far, they've all been about reversion fees and accusations that we're profiteering from the process, whereas actually the charging regs, the way local authorities charge for their building control service means that it's not a fee earn, it's a non-fee earning. So it's not non-fee earning. Enforcement is non-fee earning, but a reversion, if you have to take on a reversion application, you can make a charge for carrying out that work to the service user, the person who needs that service. So of course, people who found themselves with a cancelled initial notice, and then having to, pick up the process again with the local authority, they see that they're paying twice for the same thing. And it's not the case. So everything has its challenges that we have to overcome. But that's an interesting thing that will, if I was talking about this last year, I'd know sort of most of it because it was all set in legislation. I'd know what was coming. What has actually happened is slightly different. But I think that brings me to the end of my presentation. Oops, I've got a bit. No, I haven't. Those slides aren't for showing today, so I'll see if I can stop sharing my screen and hand back to Rachel to see if we've got any questions.
Thank you, Jayne. Yeah, stop sharing your screen and we'll appear large. Everyone will be able to see our faces. That's great. So we have had some questions, as predicted, quite a few in the Q&A there.
Ooh.
So one of the more popular ones, I'll just go down to Peter. Quite a few people have put the same question in different wording, is when the principal designer is reluctant to sign, as once they finish the drawings, that's their job completed. They're not going to see the site necessarily. And we've got people that have seen multiple instances where they just want to, the principal designer just wants to pass that role onto the principal contractor, but then the principal contractor doesn't really want to take on that responsibility. Yeah, the principal designer is being worried about being held liable for design changes on site, particularly when they're not engaged with inspecting the work. So how do we navigate that, basically?
Well, I've always, it is very difficult, but I suppose you would have to sort of caveat your involvement. And yes, as I said, if a designer isn't being retained further than just getting the building control approval, the plans approved, and they're not going to be project managing or involved at all in the building works, then I suppose they could put a covering letter with their statement or their declaration to say that this is limited to pre-construction work, and then the principal contractor would then be held responsible for the principal designer role, so that he could then make changes if he wanted to, he or she, they wanted to. As long as they're happy to sign that, they've had this design input. But I mean, ideally, what we want to be doing is to be saying, well, to the client, you should really engage me to ensure that my design is built out. You've paid me to design it. The least that I should be able to do is to make sure that whoever you choose to build it does build to my design. So I don't know how we'll see that evolve. These hurdles, we've encountered this. We've had this ourselves, where you get to that point and someone's sort of starting to say, "Whoa," I think I can remember an architect speaking to me and saying, "Well, principal designer, that terminology in itself applies to CDM as well. And I'm not engaged for CDM." Construction design management regs. I've just done the scheme for this new loft conversion, and I'm not involved in anything more than that. And I've said to them, I said, well, just put your building regs not CDM when you're in next to your signature, and then it's quite clear. No one will come back to you and say, oh, I've got a document here that you signed, you were the principal designer, so I'm going to take you to task for a safety, health and safety issue. I think we have to sort of, talk about it, fork it around on the table, let building safety regulator and the government know that these sort of glitches are popping up, and get some sort of workaround, really, because it's a criteria that
question,
is
isn't it, Jane?
in the rules. Trev, you've got something to say?
Yeah, no, I say it's an unanswered question. It's one we've debated. I've debated with people like yourself and experienced people in the profession, and it's the big question that comes up. And I think, to an extent, the answer will only come when there's some litigation in the future based on the legislation that gives us a sort of case law to base our the answers to. I see Peter, a small building company he runs there, and I think some really good common sense from him. And he's saying, well, surely the correct view is that architects are responsible for a design as the PD up until building control have conducted the plan check. And then any design changes that are made on site or anything that's not built to plan, they won't be held accountable for. And therefore, they should sign as a PD on that basis. I think that's a common sense view. Unfortunately, Peter, as we all know, the law doesn't work always on a common sense basis, and hence we are floundering to answer that question. But I'm glad it's came up, and I wish more builders like yourself were in the audience. I think they're all unaware of the major implications that affect them in this legislation. And Rachel and I are talking about how can we get builders, especially small builders, round a table to sort of, give them a wake-up call. We'll work on that. It's not easy. That you're all too busy grafting, aren't you? But anyway, sorry about that.
I welcome your experience, Trev. You probably like me, you've been in the industry a while and you've seen change over the years, but nothing like this. No change like this. Exactly, you're right. It's only a problem if a problem occurs, isn't it? If I say to you, oh well, just say you're only responsible for the design up to approval, and we'll accept it going forward, and we'll accept the statement from the contractor at the end. But then if something else comes up in the interim where it gets challenged, then it becomes difficult. And like you say, case law will be the way it goes. But in the interim, I think you've got to have a common sense approach to some things. But the caveat being the law is open to interpretation, I suppose. Best I can do.
Trevor, do you want to take another
what
question?
Else we got? Right. Yeah, do you want me to read some out that I've got?
Yeah,
here?
Carry on. Got a little.
Catherine says, are there any plain English guides available for informing a domestic client of their duties under the Building Safety Act, similar to the sort of guides you get for CDM that are created by HSE? Any?
There are. I mean, the gov.uk website has got quite a bit of information on, and they're adding to it all the time. I'm not aware that anybody's drafted a householder's guide to making a building regs application. LABC have their sort of householder, I think they call it front door. I don't know if they've got anything on there, which covers, the new rules around, being a client and making a building regs application and engaging builders and things. But yeah, it would be useful if there is something out there, but I haven't got anything off the top of my head that I'm aware of.
We could tip PPLABC off maybe if there's a gap there, then that's something maybe they can.
Well, they're
publish.
sort of the, or the planning portal as well. The planning portal website is has a lot of information about building regulations, so that it's probably out there if you want to find it. But I haven't seen anything specific, and we're not sexy enough to be on the mainstream news and the public information broadcasts
Speak for
after
yourself,
the news,
Jayne.
where when
Speak
you're
for
putting a
yourself.
building regs application in, remember you got to do this, that, and the other. I think building regs is always going to be, we have to let people know what their obligations are and their responsibilities are as they need the service. And sometimes, they might have thought, oh, I didn't realise I had to do all of that. I don't really want this extension. I think I'll move. Sometimes they won't know what they have to do until they're in it, in the process.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a gap there. Perhaps I ought to start writing my book now.
Sure. Yeah, it's a short answer. Sorry, nothing we're aware of. Lewis or Louis, I'm sorry if I pronounced it wrong. The regulation seems to auto-appoint a principal designer for domestic clients, but it also allows principal designers to stop work on a project. Does it mean that a PD can remove themselves from a domestic project? And if yes, what happens if the client fails to make a new appointment? Is that another unanswerable question? I'll pass it to you, Jayne.
I think that is probably another unanswerable question.
Yeah.
It clearly says if you're not competent to do something, you have to, as a designer, you might say, oh no, you're asking me to do something that's outside my comfort zone. I'm not going to work with you anymore. I mean, it's a mix of contractual issues and building regulations legislation issues now. So I mean, again, until we start seeing, these occurrences and how they are dealt with, and it's fed back through the sort of communications loop industry wide, we're probably not going to know for sure exactly how to advise an answer to that question. But if the client fails to appoint another principal designer, I think only domestic clients are able to. They only really. I mean, a client who is a business, the obligation is greater that they should do. They should ensure that they have a principal designer. So if their first appointed one pulls off the job, then they have to, pull out all the stops to find somebody else to do it. But a domestic client can probably get away with a bit more than an ordinary client, or a business client, I would say. But it's I'm just speculating here. I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Wayne made a comment. A lot of small builders believe that building control is there to provide the design role. Yeah, we know that, and that's why, as I say, Rachel and I would like to get a lot more builders around the table at these webinars to put them straight on that. Even more so, they never were, and they certainly are not now. Alex, as a client, is there a formal notification process that needs to be followed when appointing an architect as principal designer at the start of the project, or is it just the act of appointment in itself sufficient? So does it have to be laid down in statute that they are?
No, I mean, they just have to be named on your application form for us.
Yeah. So
if you've named a designer on your application form, we presume that that's the designer you've appointed, and it's your responsibility to satisfy yourself you're confident. We won't be checking whether your designer is competent. We will be checking whether the work complies or not. And if it's not competent, there's a chance that it won't comply. So I think that's the case. We don't We will be, we check if people are registered, if there's a formal register. So if you're using a gas safe technician or an electrician who's registered on a competent person scheme to sign something for you, then we check those registers to make sure they're on the register they say they're on. But I think where someone appoints a designer, we have to take it at face value that they have done what the law requires them to do, which is satisfy themselves that their designer is competent.
Robert's more of a comment than a question, I think, really. Doesn't there need to be an agreed change of duty holder for a principal designer in order to discharge their responsibilities? He's saying they remain a PD until a change in duty holder form is provided. Someone who's done planning drawings would still be responsible until the duty changes. Not sure if I agree with that. And again, it harks back to the question we can't fully answer. But any thoughts, Jayne?
I suppose it depends. You know, we'd have to be taking the sort of specific circumstances into account if that was the case. I mean, we would assume that the designer is the one named on the application form until another designer is notified. So I suppose you're right in that respect, that there would be an assumption there, unless we are formally notified as the building control body that a principal designer has changed. Then, but I don't think we've had that situation arise yet. I mean, it would be interesting to. I think we'd bring that to one of our, regional meetings to say what happens if. We're writing an acknowledgement letter, or we're writing a letter to the principal designer, because we have to copy, we have to share, we share and communicate with all parties like they should be sharing and communicating with each other. Inspection notes, for instance. So we might send a copy of inspection notes to the contractor, the client, and the designer, so that everybody knows what's going on. And if a designer returns the notes and says, I'm not a designer anymore, I'm guessing we would then go back to the client to say, well, we need to have a new designer, please. Your designer has contacted us. But over and above that, I'm not really sure. It probably depends on individual circumstances.
The interesting one from a retired architect doing some of his own work and managing individual subcontractors for foundations, steel beams, etc. So he is both the client, the PD, and the PC. So as long as he believes he's competent in all those different things and will be held liable himself. And
that's interesting.
That's right.
It is interesting, because nobody's ever said to me, can they all be the same person? If you're self-builder, and you've designed it and you're doing it yourself, could you be this? Could it, and it means that you're solely accountable, isn't it? I mean, I suppose that the thing we have here is it's about accountability for compliance. So we know who the contractor is, we know who designed it, and we know who the client is on our application form. That's what we need to know. It's about making sure we have the information we need moving forward for those communications that we have to make with those individuals, whether that's through the build process, letting them know how our inspections are going and if there's anything we need to raise, right through to, do we need to serve a stop notice, or do we need to embark on a sort of an enforcement process with this particular job. We've got those contact details. I'm thinking that's perhaps what the building control body would be looking at, as they know who's who on the job.
And on that theme, a question that keeps coming up and gets batted around, and I know when I'm ever in the office, is so the fact, like a lot of architects, let's call them plan drawers, maybe doing a bit of money, maybe they're doing it for a bit of cash or whatever, and they don't want to put their name down on any application forms or formal documents. So the client says, well, don't worry, I'll take responsibility as the principal designer. Well, what's your qualifications for that, designer? Maybe you work in a completely different industry. You clearly don't have any qualifications in many cases, in probably most cases. And so for the building control audience out there, I wonder what you think. Should building control just accept that and say, well, if he's willing to sign it off, even though we know it's highly likely he's not competent, should we just accept it, or should we challenge it? And it alludes back to Jayne's point about how to prove competence and what formal way there is to do that. So
I think
this
is a situation where you could sort of argue a conflict of interest scenario, couldn't you? If someone's done a design for someone and said, well, I'm not going to have myself named, I think it probably won't matter until things go wrong in some ways. I think the thing is, if some dispute arises or some claim comes through between the client and a designer, if you haven't followed the right processes, that puts you on the back foot in the first place, doesn't it? And it isn't all necessarily about, I mean, we're talking about building regulations and building control compliance and signing that you're responsible for, designing or building out a building that meets all the relevant requirements of those building regulations. But there are other things to play in a building contract, isn't there? There's other things to play in contracts between clients and their designers and their contractors, whereby would you want to design something knowingly and be paid for it and then say, I'm not signing that, and letting the client do it, only to have the client sort of fall out with you about something later? Where does that put you professionally? It's it's more than just a legal question, isn't it? It's a competence, ethics, all those sorts of things come into play, I think.
I've got an interesting one. Oh, got one, Trevor?
No, please.
Crack on. This is one I haven't come across before, but someone said, what about the end? Where do the engineers fit in? Where do the other specialist designers fit in? Waterproofing, fire engineers, acoustic consultants. So presuming we're on about sort of not residential buildings here. I suppose the clue is in the name principle.
Yes, yeah, it's a bit like yes, they would still have a duty. There are designers have duties in the building regulations. Contractors have duties in the building regulations, but the client needs to appoint a principal one of each of those to lead the coordination role. So you could end up, the engineer could take on the principal designer role if they're wanting to project manage it. If it's that type of project that needs a bit more, they'll have more input. There's more to it on the engineering side than there is on the general design side. A specialist designer might become a principal designer and then take on that role of coordinating the other subcontractors and other designers. So whoever signs the principal contractor role on the application for building regs approval is going to be the key point of contact. It's going to be assumed that they will have some sort of control over not control over everybody else, but oversight over everybody else, so you're performing that function.
Thank you. Okay, a few more minutes, Trevor. Have you got any more?
Just one. All right, we'll use those up. Lee brings attention to the possible conflict of interest where that he's aware that there's an RBCA registered building control approver inspector that is undertaking a building control role as well as a warranty role, a warranty provision, and he's saying surely this has to be a conflict.
Well, it could be. It needs to be. It would be for the RBCA, the Registered Building Control Approver company or individual to record that conflict of interest and manage it. Just because there's a conflict of interest doesn't mean to say you can't do something about it. You can put mitigation in place to ensure that there isn't a crossover. But again, it very much depends on the individual circumstances. If you think there's something sort of fishy going on, or sort of backhanders going on, or somebody's, using one role to advantage themselves in another role, then there is a clear conflict of interest. And we can all, any member of the public can take a concern directly to the building safety regulator if they wish to. I mean, ideally, you want to go through the complaints procedure of the building control body that you're concerned about in the first place. So that, if it's an oversight or something, they can put something in place and correct it. But if it's a deliberate act and you're very concerned about it, or if it's repetitive or it's on a bigger scale, there are complaints processes that you can follow to raise that concern and get it independently looked at. So.
Yeah, and we wouldn't see the warranty standards are going to conflict with building regulations requirements. So it's it does help in that respect. Something that complies with building regs can easily comply with warranty and vice versa. So
I would have thought so. And traditionally, I mean, we got NHBC traditionally offer a warranty service and a building control service and use the same individuals. I think companies will be probably more cautious about that now, and but making sure there is that sort of separation so that any real or perceived conflict of interests can't occur. But yeah, I mean, typically someone looking to insure a building, they'll be looking at different things than building regulations. Obviously, they'll be looking for things that might fail and cost them money on the insurance claims. But if someone's using that role to benefit themselves in any way, and it's not good. So they're sort of saying, well, I can do your. If you choose me to do your building regs, I'll do your warranty as well, or vice versa. Then maybe that's a bit different. I mean, you have to understand the circumstances, I suppose, the circumstances in which that scenario's arisen. But ideally, you want to avoid conflict of interest, real or perceived.
Right. Well, are we about there then, Rach? Should we wrap it up?
I think unless you've got any insight into the building safety regulator, there's one that says approval and rejection of applications can cause major delays to work such as building maintenance projects of HRBs. What improvements are in the pipeline to reduce bottlenecks in application assessment? I think unless we've got a secret insight into that.
I was going to say, I don't think I can talk for the building safety regulator at all, really. That's their resourcing issues. I think it's not like they're not aware of them, and it's being talked about a lot. I see a lot of chats about this on the sort of LinkedIn and other social media about the delays and the unintended sort of consequences that have arisen from that, and I think industry leaders are in direct dialogue with the government probably about it as well, so I think, but no, it's not something we can really comment on, I don't think, on that, other than we know it's not rolling out as nicely as everybody hoped it would, but then it's a huge change to everyone, and I think everyone involved as well. I think BSR in their own defence have said something about quality of submissions, missing information, stuff like that. It's a teething problem that hopefully will resolve in time.
Yeah, I think they're trying to do a few of their own webinars, so maybe you can hook in on some of those and get an opportunity to ask a question and get it from the horse's mouth. But we aren't that, unfortunately. So can't really flesh out that question very much. Right, we've just coming to a close. I just a last comment from Peter, that common sense guy. He says, hopefully we'll see a licensing of UK builders to weed out the cowboys now. Well, yeah, hopefully, but I wouldn't hold your breath there, Peter. Yeah, we've been talking that for many, many years, and I don't see it on the horizon. Do you, Jayne?
I don't think it's going to, even if somebody's thinking about it, it's not going to be something that's going to be implemented overnight. It would be very complicated to implement. It was hard enough to deal with something like 4,000 building inspectors, wasn't it? So when you multiply how many times more builders there are, particularly the smaller SMEs, one-man bands and all of that, it would be a mammoth task to hold a register of that. But I think, clients, particularly domestic clients, being a bit more discerning, a bit more aware, perhaps having, if they're aware of their responsibilities and their duties, they might not, give someone a tenner down the pub and say, oh, you do it for me. It's a big cultural change, which is going to take some time to bed in at all sectors and all levels.
Right. Well, if the sign of a good webinar is stimulating lots of interesting questions, then you cracked it, Jayne. Fantastic. And
but I never know
really
when I'm rambling away whether I'm making any sense at all. And I'm sure I did a duplicate slide in there because either that or I was having a bit of deja vu. But as I said, if I've told you twice, then maybe.
Yeah, it needed it was an important thing. It needed telling doubly, I'm sure. So no problem there.
Yeah.
So I'll wrap it up then, shall I?
Will we be putting the slides up, Rachel, on our?
We've recorded the session, so anybody that's registered on Teams, that should, once it's processed, will appear in your Teams automatically. But I'll also download it and put it on our YouTube channel so you can watch it as and when you wish. Yeah, thanks for joining us. And if you do want to hear about any future webinars, or if you want to subscribe to our communications, then do go onto the Hertfordshire Building Control website, scroll down the page and pop your details in, and you can hear from us regularly.
And can I just say, before we all go, take this opportunity, she won't thank me for it, but this is Jayne's swan song appearance, and what a good one it was, because she's very soon going to be leaving the company. So sorry, Jayne, don't go away, because I'm going to take this opportunity to thank you for your huge contribution made to the company over the years you've been here. We did really well to recruit somebody like yourself. But more importantly, to thank you for being such a nice person to work with. And I know all my colleagues say that about you. You're an absolute top to work with and deal with, and you'll be very much missed. So thanks again for a great seminar, and best of luck in the future, whichever way that goes.
Thank you for those very kind words, Trevor. It's been an absolute pleasure working with you all as well. It's been a super company to be with, and I shall miss you all too. But we'll stay in touch. I won't be, I won't be able to stop myself talking about building regs. And anybody who's ever been to a CABE event or anything, found themselves trapped in the corner in the bar with me, will know that I can bend your ear till midnight on building regulations if you want me to. So yeah, I'll still be about.
Okay, thanks everyone.
All the best, everyone, and thank you for all your time and attending. I hope it was worth your while.
Thank you.
Yeah, see you all again soon.
Cheers.
Cheers.